World War II had ended. Cities were rebuilding. Empires were collapsing. Millions of soldiers had gone home, laid down their weapons, and tried to return to normal life. But deep in the Philippine jungle, one man still believed the war was going on. For him, nothing was over. He was not hiding for days, not for weeks, not even for a few months. He remained there for years, then decades, moving through the forest with a rifle, a uniform slowly falling apart, and a belief so strong that even reality itself could not easily break it. Leaflets were dropped, messages were sent, voices called out to him from the outside world. They told him the war was finished, Japan had surrendered, everything had changed. He refused to believe any of it. His name was Hiroo Onoda, a Japanese intelligence officer sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines near the end of the war. His mission sounded simple, but its consequences would become extraordinary. He was ordered to disrupt enemy activity, gather information, and most importantly, never surrender. He was told to hold on no matter what happened, no matter how long it took, no matter what he heard. In war, orders are supposed to create discipline. In his case, those orders built a prison inside his mind. When American and Filipino forces advanced, Japanese positions on the island collapsed. The war that had once looked structured and organized turned into chaos. Units were destroyed, communication broke down, and survivors scattered. Onoda retreated into the jungle with a small group of other Japanese soldiers. They were cut off, isolated, and increasingly disconnected from the world beyond the trees. But isolation alone does not explain what happened next. Many soldiers are cut off. Few remain at war for nearly 30 years. What kept Onoda going was not just fear. It was conviction. He believed surrender was dishonorable. He believed reports of Japan's defeat were enemy tricks designed to draw him out. He believed newspapers, leaflets, and broadcasts could all be forged. And once a man accepts that every piece of evidence against his worldview might be deception, escaping that worldview becomes almost impossible. Every new attempt to reach him only confirmed what he already believed. The war had not ended. The enemy had simply become more clever. At first, he was not alone. A few other Japanese holdouts stayed with him, sharing the same jungle, the same shortages, and the same suspicion of the outside world. They survived by stealing rice, raiding supplies, and living off whatever they could find. They moved carefully, watched local activity, and treated every sound as a possible threat. For the people living on the island, these men were not ghosts from history. They were a real danger, still armed, still active, still refusing to disappear. Years passed. That is what makes this story so difficult to understand. It was not one long dramatic battle. It was repetition, rain, mud, hunger, waiting, the same trees, the same fear, the same belief repeated until it hardened into something stronger than common sense. The world outside changed in ways Onoda could not imagine. New wars came and went. Technology advanced. Japan transformed. Yet in the jungle, time seemed frozen. There were moments when the truth came close. Leaflets announced the war's end. Family photographs were left behind. Letters appeared. Loudspeakers called his name. Search parties tried to convince him. At one point, even news of new global events reached the island. But Onoda interpreted everything through the logic that had kept him alive. If the enemy wanted him to surrender, of course they would say the war was over. If they wanted to weaken his resolve, of course they would use emotion. In his mind, skepticism was survival. One by one, the men around him disappeared. Some surrendered. Some died. But Onoda remained, still armed, still convinced, still following orders issued in a completely different world. And the longer he lasted, the harder it became for him to imagine that he had been wrong all along. Because if he accepted that truth, then what had all those years meant? By the early 1970s, Hiroo Onoda was no longer just a hidden soldier. He had become something else entirely, a man trapped between history and belief, living inside a war that had ended almost 30 years earlier. And yet, in his own mind, his mission was still not finished. What makes that opening chapter so haunting is how ordinary his routine became. He cleaned his rifle, repaired clothing, watched paths, studied movement, treated rumors as weapons. Survival became a discipline, and discipline became identity. He was no longer simply a soldier carrying out a mission. He had become the mission itself, unable to separate duty from existence. Even hunger, loneliness, and exhaustion did not weaken that identity. They strengthened it. Every hardship seemed to prove that surrender would dishonor the sacrifice behind him. The end came because the outside world refused to forget him. In 1974, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki went looking for 3 things he believed were worth finding: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. It sounded almost absurd, but Suzuki carried something many official search teams had lacked. He was not trying to outmaneuver Onoda. He was trying to reach him as a human being. And somehow, impossibly, he succeeded. Deep in the jungle, nearly 30 years after the war had ended, Suzuki found the man who had refused to surrender. Their meeting was extraordinary, not only because it happened, but because of how Onoda responded. He did not emerge confused or broken. He emerged disciplined, alert, and still committed to his mission. He spoke with Suzuki. He listened, but he would not surrender simply because a stranger told him the war was over. In his mind, only one thing could release him from duty: a direct order from his commanding officer. That demand might have seemed impossible, yet it became the key to ending one of the strangest wartime stories in modern history. Japan located Onoda's former commander, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who by then was living an ordinary civilian life. He was brought to Lubang Island and entered the jungle to meet the soldier who had continued obeying his orders for almost 3 decades. When Taniguchi finally spoke, he did not argue abstractly. He did not try to debate history. He issued the command Onoda had been waiting for all those years. The mission was over. The war was over. He was relieved of his duties. Only then did Onoda accept reality. It is hard to imagine what that moment felt like. One order had shaped his life. Another ended it. The structure that had governed his every decision suddenly collapsed. The world he had resisted for so long rushed in all at once. The empire he believed he still served no longer existed in the form he remembered. Japan had changed. The war had become history. And he, somehow, had survived long enough to step out of one era and into another without ever truly living in between. When Onoda surrendered, he did so in uniform, carrying his rifle, ammunition, grenades, and sword. The image was shocking precisely because it looked like time had folded in on itself. Here was a man physically emerging from the 1940s into the 1970s, as if history had opened and released someone it had forgotten to collect. For people around the world, the story was fascinating. For many in Japan, it was emotional, complicated, and deeply symbolic. Some saw loyalty and discipline. Others saw tragedy, indoctrination, and the terrible human cost of absolute obedience. Both interpretations contain truth. That is what makes Onoda's story so powerful. It is not just a story about survival. It is a story about belief so strong that facts became powerless against it. It is about the danger of identity built entirely around duty. And it is about what happens when a person is trained so completely for one reality that he cannot step into another, even when the evidence surrounds him for years. In one sense, Onoda was extraordinary. Few human beings could endure what he endured. The jungle itself was relentless. Heat, disease, isolation, fear, and hunger would have broken most men long before the decades passed. That endurance commands attention. But endurance alone is not wisdom. Survival alone is not truth. A man can survive for years and still be trapped by a lie he tells himself in order to keep going. That is the darker side of the story. Onoda's refusal to surrender was built on courage, but also on rigidity, on discipline, but also on delusion. He was not simply a loyal soldier abandoned by time. He was a warning about what can happen when obedience becomes so sacred that reality itself is treated like the enemy. The same mindset that kept him alive also kept him imprisoned. Every leaflet became a trick. Every voice became a deception. Every chance to return became another reason to hide. And yet, when he finally came home, the world could not look away. Because his story reached beyond war, it touched something older and more unsettling. The human ability to believe against all evidence, to keep defending an identity long after the world that created it has vanished. That is why Hiroo Onoda still fascinates people, not because he stayed in the jungle, but because he stayed inside a vanished war with total sincerity. He was not pretending. He was not performing. He believed. World War II ended in 1945, but for one soldier, it did not truly end until 1974. And that is what makes this one of the most haunting stories the war ever left behind. It was the collision between history and psychology, between the world as it was and the world one man could still bear to accept. In the end, Onoda did not merely surrender a weapon, he surrendered an entire version of reality,